Hello and welcome to The Found Cause. We're found in cars and serving the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm Michael, the man behind the machine, and to my right, your left is...
Sebastian, the bookkeeper.
Hey Sebastian, how has the week been? We actually took 2 weeks off, not that you would know, but we did a 2-part episode, so we got a week off. How has it been since then?
I have been very busy, Michael.
Yeah?
Yes. As part of the board of my church, I have stepped up the way we do things here.
Mm-hmm. Small little church, you have a lot of influence, okay?
From now on, all the men will wear suits to church. All the women, they will be required to wear head coverings and Amish dresses. No skin. It has to be made by Amish ladies.
Okay, got it.
It's a must.
Godly, okay.
And then, if you even think about or talk about dancing, we will stone you in front of the whole congregation.
Well, I mean, that sounds about right.
And don't even let me catch you talking to any of them liberals.
Sebastian, don't you know, okay, that seems a little legalistic. Don't you know that Christianity is all about peace and love and doing whatever you want, like just fornicating on stage and doing drugs in the back room and stuff like that? That's what Jesus would do.
I say let's have a chat after this podcast, Michael.
All right. And
in front of my church.
That's a patented Found Cause intro. Thanks for bearing with us. This is an episode not about doing any of those things. Sebastian's not advocating for strange, I don't even know what that was a mix of, like one is Pentecostals and Fundamental Baptists or something like that, and mine was non-existing churches as well, maybe the Corinthians. Today's episode is going to be about the 2 sides of the extreme of how you take God's law, specifically the Pharisaical side, using the Pharisees in the Bible as the prime example of overextending on God's law, and then the decently common example, even from Jesus' time, but also today, of doing away with God's law and being hypo-legalistic? Not hyper, but hypo. I think I'm using my medical Latin correctly.
No, you're correct. Yes, you're correct.
In any case, that's what today's episode is on. So let's start with the premise. Here's a passage that I think every single Christian, whether conservative churches or liberal churches, need to wrestle with. And I have decent experience in my own church histories of people not really wrestling with this passage enough. And that is from Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus says this: "Don't think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter, nor one stroke of a letter from the law will pass away from the law until all things are accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven." So, from this, and Jesus is about to go into his large Sermon on the Mount about murder being in your heart before it's actually murder, and all these things that people would go to show that the law is more than it was in the Old Testament. Now, I dispute that description. I don't think that the law was more. I think Jesus was explaining how the law always was. I don't think God was okay with murder in the heart in the Old Testament. It's just there wasn't civil penalties for it, nor are there in the Sermon on the Mount. But what we all have to contend with is that here's Jesus essentially commending the legalism of the Pharisees, of the scribes, and saying that you need to surpass the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. So it's not that you shouldn't be like the Pharisees and Sadducees. It's that you should be better, or Pharisees and scribes, that should you be better than them in following the law. And not even one jot or tittle, some translations would say, that my translation says, not one stroke of a letter or one letter from the law will be done away with until all these things are fulfilled. And so as a Christian, we need to examine the law, because I think the vast majority of, at least of American Christians, are very undereducated, not well thought out about what the law is and how we handle it today. So that being a question, it juxtaposes with a much more common example that we're familiar with from the Bible, and that is all the times where Jesus does things the Pharisees, the people he was just saying were good but not good enough, how he interacts with them. For example, from just one of many examples, from Luke 14, it says, "One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat at the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him, a man was suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, 'Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?' But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then he asked them, if one of you had a child or an ox that fell into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out? And they had nothing to say. And this is, again, it's not a unique occurrence. He says this often to Pharisees when they are, especially around the Sabbath, but also on some other laws. But particularly in the Sabbath, I know from Matthew as well, the book of Matthew, him and his disciples are walking through the grain fields. And so the disciples are picking and eating some of the heads of grain in the grain fields, and it was on the Sabbath. So the Pharisees call out and say, see, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. And Jesus' response to them is, have you not read what David and those who were with him did, how they entered the house of God, the tabernacle at the time, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for them to eat, but only for the priests? And that, so he counters with a non-Sabbath example, but showing that God's anointed are allowed to do things that normal people wouldn't normally be allowed to do. And then he also says, he adds to that example, or do not know how the priests enter and do their work in the temple on the Sabbath and are innocent? So they're doing work, which is not lawful on the Sabbath, but they're in the temple and they're sanctified, so therefore they're innocent. And he says to them, if you would learn what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for something greater than the temple is here himself. And then he says, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And so Jesus' general defense of working on the Sabbath, which, to the Pharisees' credit in this example, picking and eating heads of grain would be considered working on the Sabbath from the Exodus laws. And I have some quotations from Exodus, but I won't read them all because it's kind of scattered in the full Sabbath law in Exodus. But specifically, God says, you shall not do any work on the Sabbath. You and your male and female servants shall not do any work. Your children, your servants, your animals, none of them should do work on the Sabbath. You're not allowed to start a fire on the Sabbath. Therefore, you're really not allowed to cook on the Sabbath. And they even stone a man rightfully, like judged as good by God and Moses in the Pentateuch for gathering firewood on the Sabbath. And so the Sabbath keeping is a holy law from God's law, considered righteous in upholding it. So the Pharisees are attempting to follow God's law. And so when the disciples are picking and eating some heads of grain, one could say the Pharisees are in the right to say that's not lawful. But Jesus' defense is that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. And so he decides what's lawful or not. And so them being with him is like priests being within the temple, and that all their actions are good and sanctified on the Sabbath, just like priests in the temple are allowed to do their work on the Sabbath and not be judged for it. So the Pharisees' problem there wasn't that they were trying to hold to the Sabbath law, but that they were rejecting Jesus as Lord of the Sabbath. So that's one way you could handle this juxtaposition, the fact that in Matthew 5, Jesus is saying, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, essentially saying the law is still upheld. And meanwhile, he's also breaking the Sabbath in front of the Pharisees. So he is not breaking the law because he is the Lord of the Sabbath. At the very least, we can establish that. I'll just keep rambling unless you have any interjections here, Sebastian.
No, you're on fire. Keep going.
One other thing that I think you should note is that, yes, there's examples like the picking and eating of heads of grain that the Pharisees might have been in the right, but they rejected Jesus, so that therefore they're in the wrong on the Sabbath issue. But there are also many examples, all the examples of the Pharisees picking a problem with Jesus are on something that they have added to the Sabbath. So it's questionable or outright deniable that their interpretation of working on the Sabbath is correct. For example, the one that I just quoted from Luke 14, Jesus asked them, and the same situation happens in Matthew 2, when he heals a man with a shriveled hand. The Pharisees ask, and Jesus asked them in this case, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Because there's no express healing laws from Exodus. There's nothing that specifically describes healing. So the Pharisees stay silent because they don't like Jesus, and they want to be able to charge him with doing something unlawful, and he keeps breaking their own codes of Sabbath laws. So therefore, they want to charge him with healing on the Sabbath, as in he's working on the Sabbath, which would be punishable by death technically, although they weren't really doling out the death penalty a lot those days, although they did to Jesus at the end. In any case, he goes ahead and heals anyways, Jesus. So I think by us Christians, we can know that it was lawful to heal on the Sabbath. And he says, if you had a child, and in Matthew he says similarly, if you had a sheep that fell into a pit, would you not immediately pull it out? Like the Sabbath law is built for men, and therefore, yes, you should keep to it strictly. That was God's law, was to keep to it strictly. and to stone those who go out, for example, to gather firewood, something that was not necessary to do, or to cook on the Sabbath, and it's lighting the fire, again, something that's not required to do. But if somebody is in need, in trouble, like a child or an animal that falls into a pit, or somebody that needs healing, it's lawful to do what is good in the Sabbath. That you should not have expanded the law to include excluding good things, right? Therefore, the problem with the Pharisees in these cases, when they're expanding the Sabbath law, is not that they're zealous about the Sabbath law, but they have expanded on what the Sabbath law is, and therefore they've made themselves God, themselves judge, and not God. They've gone over what God's law is. And so that, I would call, and I think I've heard other Christian theologians say that is the definition of legalism. So legalism, in and of itself, is not what most people think it is, and that is holding to the law strictly. It's actually the opposite. It's holding to what's not the law strictly. So that if you hold to things that are not actually God's law strictly as if they were law, that's legalism. And that's where Pharisaicalism is a bad thing, when there's excess of laws. So when there's the quarter-deciman rule, where the Pharisees say that you don't have to honor your father and your mother with support and monetary inheritance and support if you gift your gift to the temple. You're cleaned from it. That's nowhere found in God's law. It's a straight tradition from the Pharisees, and therefore God calls them out. Jesus calls them out and says, hypocrites. Isaiah prophesied it correctly about you when he said that you teaches doctrine, human commands. And so the essence, again, of the Pharisaical legalism that Jesus was calling out was, one, the rejection of him as the Messiah. So there's that. That's just like straight Pharisees. Everybody involved, the Sadducees, anybody that was against Jesus was called out for that. But also that they were expanding the law. They were teaching as doctrine human commands. And I think, if you see where we're going with this, it's highly applicable in all ages of the earth, including today, of people expanding what they think makes righteousness to things that the law of God do not talk about. So, namely, a big example would be the Catholic Church. Huge into teaching as doctrine human commands. So the human commands might be reasonable, perhaps, right? Some of the Pharisaical laws could have been reasonable, but they obviously had a reason to say that giving your gift to the temple was honoring to God, and therefore you didn't have to honor your parents because you were honoring God, and God's above your parents. That was their reasoning. Sounds reasonable even to us today. But Jesus called them out because they're obeying man's tradition versus God, and that's the problem. And equally, eating with unwashed hands, in excess of the law, it's arguable that it's not actually from God's law in the Old Testament, but the Pharisees were requiring it. Scribes and the Pharisees were assuming it was required in their day, and so they come up to Jesus and say, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders if they don't wash their hands when they eat? And he says, why do you break God's law? Because of your tradition, right? They've added to God's law tradition. They've broken his law, actually, in this case, because of tradition with the quarter-deciman rule, the giving of gifts to the temple instead of your parents. Again, all this summing up to say, Pharisaicalism comes in two parts. One, the rejection of Jesus. That was associated with the Pharisees historically. But Pharisaicalism, the legalism of today, is the expanding of God's law, which should not be done.
Exhorting your own rules over God's commands.
Yes, so I think that's the most egregious example of legalism is going over God's law with your own law, plainly. But I actually think it extends also to not necessarily going against God's law, but adding to God's law where you should not. So, like in the Sabbath examples, right? They're not going against God's law in saying that lifting up an animal out of a pit is considered work on the Sabbath and you're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. They're actually expanding on God's law. They're adding rules that aren't in God's law, and that is considered wicked as well.
Interesting. So there's a spectrum. Adding to what's already there versus creating your own.
Yeah, I guess you could argue. So God's law also includes loving your neighbor. And so if you don't lift your child out of the pit, right? If he falls into a pit on the Sabbath, then you aren't loving your neighbor, this child, and therefore you are breaking God's law because of your tradition. Because your tradition is that it's work to lift up your child out of there, but God's law is that you save this child, and so you were favoring your tradition rather than the law if you weren't going to pick it up. Same goes for healing in the case of Jesus.
Interesting.
So that's a brief synopsis of Pharisaicalism. How do we keep the opposite example, and what you'll hear many people quote to avoid Pharisaicalism, because the Pharisees are obviously an enemy in the New Testament. Even your smallest Bible kid knows that the Pharisees are the bad boys. And so the thing you'll hear today quoted so often that it'll make your ears bleed is from Romans 6. Do you have that up?
I do.
And again, the common Sunday school example that it is in the Bible and we should examine it, but it comes with its own drawbacks.
Here, I'll start with 14. For sin shall no longer be your master, because you're not under the law, but under grace. What then? Shall we sin because we're not under the law, but under grace? By no means. Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey, whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. So, and I'll also quote from other sections in Romans, but
well, let's start with that one.
With it here, yes. Mm-hmm. Let's start here. So, his argument has been building up, and we'll go back to. We shouldn't just, some people might say, because we have been set free from the law, we can just do whatever we want. However, the law had a purpose, and we shouldn't just completely disregard it as Paul is stating here.
Well, and you're reading more than some would, so I'm going to just break it down into its minutia. Some would just quote, you were not under law, but under grace, and say that that's the reason we don't need to hold to God's law anymore, which is, like, we agree with Romans 6, but that's not fully orbed. It's not even fully orbed of the section of Romans 6, which Sebastian did a good job of quoting the whole context there. So if somebody says, or your natural response as a Christian is, the reason I don't have to think about eating shrimp or worry about the Sabbath or any of God's law from Leviticus, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy is because we're no longer under law but under grace. That's not a very good response, because there's actually more to it. Even from Romans 6, his immediate application, Paul's immediate application is, we're not under law but under grace. So yes, we are no longer judged by the law. That's not our salvation or not, right? Agreed. Absolutely agreed. In fact, that's the gospel, right? Hooray. Praise God that we're no longer under law but under grace. However, he immediately says, what then? Should we just sin because we no longer have the law and therefore we're under grace and we can do whatever we want? Well, absolutely not. And also, what you're insinuating, and what some might not see, is that how do we know what sin is if we don't have the law? So Paul, if you read the whole context and his later chapters, is certainly advocating for the law being used to determine what sin is. And therefore, the law is still valid, which goes back to Jesus' statement in Matthew 5, which is, he did not come to abolish the law. The law is not gone. It's been fulfilled. And fulfilling does not mean abolishing it. So a lot of Christians today read this and they say, okay, Jesus says he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And by fulfill, he means we no longer have to listen to the law because we're under law, not grace. And that, honestly, that is probably the vast majority of the reasoning from Christians in America today, which is wrong, because that would make Jesus saying, I didn't come to destroy the law, but to destroy it, which is not true.
Yeah, my instinct was just even to clarify that. I just couldn't even just partially cut it off. So I had to clarify already from instinct what the purpose was, and what Paul is saying, that no, you shouldn't just ignore it. But you've said some nice words. Fulfill. Let's start with fulfill. When Jesus said, I came to fulfill, you fulfill something that has a purpose, that has an intention, that has a meaning behind it. Wouldn't you agree?
Uh-huh.
So then, what would the meaning of this law be? That would be the natural question we should all be asking, no matter where you stand on this. Do you know what the purpose of the law is? I'm asking this rhetorically, of course. I say also, if you're not satisfied, clearly Jesus did away with it. Well, Paul expands on this even before getting to this statement in Romans 5, and I want to do some justice to Paul here and go and start even as early as I can on Romans 5. And this is the purpose. He starts talking about what sin is, and then he applies to what the purpose of the law is relating to sin. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, in this way death came to all people, because all sinned. To be sure, sin was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not charged against anyone's account where there is no law. Side note, that merits its own discussion on its own, which is fascinating, like places that never had the law, but I digress. Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command, as did Adam, who is a pattern of the one to come. Now, later on, the law was brought in so that the trespass might increase. But where sin increased, grace increased all the more. So that just as sin reigned in death, so also grace might reign through righteousness to bring eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. And then he rhetorically asked too, what shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase?
Absolutely not.
Definitely not. So, we are those who have died to sin, so how can we live in it any longer? And then, go ahead, as I look up the next part.
Well, so in summary, in case you're not understanding all the nuance here, there's a lot to talk about here. We won't talk about it all, because we could make this episode about how do we apply the law today, or how are we justified exclusively, which we're touching on, but that's not the main focus of the episode. The main focus of this episode is to figure out what does it mean to be not a Pharisee, but also not somebody who is abolishing the law, right? So here we're clearly showing that the go-to passages for people who say we have abolished the law, right? Like no more law, it's time to do whatever you want. If they read the full context, even partially, even the next sentences of Paul being not under law but under grace means still recognizing that the law is valid.
Yes, and he's going to ask, is the law sinful? Because what I've been saying is, the law points to sin. Mm-hmm. Therefore, is the law sinful? He says, no. As someone who I advocate for Living Waters Ministry, Ray Comfort, he uses the law as a mirror to show people how much you need God. I say, in summary, if you want to take something from this, the law should point you to God and the necessity of mercy, because you shouldn't be like some self-righteous Pharisee saying, yes, I'm going to live perfectly by all of this. Mm-hmm. Your question should be, my goodness, how am I ever going to live? How am I ever going to perfectly check the list? Hence why Jesus came to do that, because he's the only, I would say, human who could do that, because he was God in human form. That's hence why he was able to do that. All of that goes to say, the law is sinful. It is not sinful. I would not have known what sin is had it not been for the law. Again, the mirror analogy. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said it. You shall not covet. And then sin seizes opportunity, of course. And then just to wrap up with Romans, because I think it's worth just as a nice wrap up with this. Therefore, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. For what the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering. And so he condemned sin in the flesh in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fully met in us, who do not live according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Mm-hmm. A nice bow tie wrap-up of his argument.
And what's so crucial to me, so it's applicable to many parties, so there's definitely those parties of Christians or people in general that say, oh, we don't have to listen to any rules because we're saved. Once saved, always saved. It's important to show that they're wrong by quoting things like this. It's also important to show that legalist people, which again, I don't have a lot of experience with, but there certainly are Christians today that put too many requirements on salvation, right? You need to speak in tongues and have repented, or you need to no dancing, no smoking, no gambling, right? Like you were saying before, long dresses or head coverings or things that are argued on whether or not they're righteous, but they shouldn't be salvation, and they shouldn't be necessarily even sin versus non-sin. So there's definitely groups like that we are talking to, but one that's close to my heart are a large portion of conservative Christians who, again, their immediate response to why are we not Pharisees today? Why were the Pharisees wrong is we're not under the law, but we're under grace. They would all agree that the law is the mirror on which we see condemnation. Mm-hmm. But the next logical step there is that means the law is valid. Because again, I think, in my experience, the vast majority of Christians here in the United States do not believe the law is valid anymore, and yet simultaneously they agree that the law is used to show your condemnation. So which is it? Is God's law good and valid, or is it completely done away with in Christ? I would strongly advocate that we link the two ideas and say, yes, the law brings death. It condemns you. You see that you don't live up. That's why you need Jesus. And the vast majority of evangelical Christians in the USA agree. Yes, the law shows you that you need Jesus. You can't fulfill it. We're all in agreement there. But that means, because you're using it as condemnation for yourself, or it's revealing your condemnation, that means the law is valid. So we have to wrestle with the law and it being valid, how it's fulfilled in Christ, how it should apply today. Those are all questions maybe for a different episode. But in any case, let's not forget that if you want to use the law as condemnation for the whole gospel, which is integral to the gospel message, to most any evangelical Christian, you have to wrestle with the fact that the law is still valid. That's why it's condemning. And that's what Romans is talking about.
And again, this is the law of God, not our own personal additions.
Yes,
that we've added.
Exactly. So we've talked about Pharisaicalism and legalism, and that is the side that most people would be a-okay condemning. That is that the Pharisees were wrong in their rejection of Jesus, obviously, but also their extensions, their expansions of the law that were ungodly, right? Their expansions of the Sabbath law, their expansions of the dietary laws, their expansions of certain piety laws and gifting laws and other things like that, that not only were excessive and over God's law, up and above God's law, or really below God's law, expanding on it, but also sometimes we're in stark contrast with God's law, like the Quarter-Testament rule or others. So that side of things is wrong, and again, I think most people are on board with condemning that, but also the lawless side is wrong too. The lawless side can look like free love, sex, and drugs, which most people would realize is not the Christian way to live, but it can also look like pretending like the law doesn't have validity today, or not understanding how the law is valid today, and hating God's law. In fact, saying that God's law is bad, or the God of the Old Testament was bad, or didn't understand, or it was the culture of the time that made the law the way it was. And so it's not really God's best law. It's really, he was making do with the brutal cavemen of the Israelites. And so he just gave them law for their culture. And today we have a different culture. God gave a good law back then. He's fulfilled it today through Jesus Christ. So yes, the fulfilling version of it through Jesus Christ is better today than it was with the Israelites, but it wasn't a bad law with the Israelites back then. It brought death because men are sinful and they get condemned by the law, and nobody perfectly fulfills the law, but it wasn't bad law. It was God, the Almighty God, giving the law. So he wasn't capitulating to Israelite culture in his law.
I just get hives, Michael, whenever anyone says that that God in the Old Testament is a big meanie. I itch. Again, you've heard me say it multiple times already. What about all those passages that God shows mercy, compassion for the sake of David, for the sake of my people Israel? I will spare you. I will not bring destruction on you. Or even to some complete strangers like the Ninevites, for example. They've repented. I will not bring destruction on them. Again, compassion all over the place. Despite all the transgressions that Ninevites or Israelites, Judeans, whatever, Hebrews have done, repentance to God, he shows compassion and mercy when you do that, which I think is actually behind the essence of the law, pointing you to the need for God's mercy, which would later come through the Mashiach, the Messiah himself. And I would say you're doing yourself a big disservice when you just ditch out the law completely when you're presenting the gospel to someone. I say it is extremely difficult to present the gospel in a meaningful way without pointing to someone's sin. And how do you point to someone's sin? By showing what the standards of God are. And
again, I think most evangelicals are familiar with that mode of evangelism, using the law to condemn people and therefore bring them to Christ, and so most of them would agree.
Yes, but it's inconsistent.
It's inconsistent, yeah. Because you get other things out of the law, like you get good politics out of the law, which is a totally different topic for a different episode. But the law is good. Don't drop it. So let's bring this down to a practical, specific level, Sebastian. How do we keep today, in modern day, how do we identify and keep ourselves and our families and our friends from being either too pharisaical, too legalistic, or too lawless and too disregarding the law? What are some examples of people being too legalistic today? I can think of a couple from the more conservative Christian side. I know that, and it's not the end of the world that these are things, and I don't think that they're necessarily sinful in and of themselves, but they definitely can become legalistic things that are an expansion of God's law, just like the Pharisees' laws of the past. For example, a lot of more conservative Christian homeschooling families outlaw certain TV shows and activities that are benign. I think they're benign, but they've decided that they might not be benign, and therefore they are outlawed and considered unclean, which you can make a certain call for your family, but when you start extending it that everybody should be doing things like I do this because the objects themselves are inherently unclean, even though there's no real biblical justification for making them unclean, that's when it becomes, I think, pharisaical or legalist. For example, Harry Potter. A lot of homeschool families notoriously do not let their children read Harry Potter because it has witchcraft connotations. And yet, just to show the flip side of things, they're perfectly fine with their kids reading Chronicles of Narnia, which has
a lot
witchcraft and magic, right? But because it's C.S. Lewis, who ends up being a Christian later in his life, wasn't even Christian at the time he was writing those, it's okay, right? And so I guess the consistent homeschool parent would ban both. I don't think that that's a particularly great position either. I think it's an expansion of God's law. It's not necessary. Again, it's not like end of the world if your parents do that or if you yourselves have done that, if you have particular justification for it. But in any case, even if you as a parent ban a bunch of books because you don't want your children influenced by them, you should not consider that God's law. That's your law. That's your parental law. It's not a sin versus non-sin thing. And therefore, parents of kids that let them read Chronicles of Narnia or whatever, or Harry Potter, aren't sinning in doing that. They may have other sins that may have led to them allowing their kids to do things they shouldn't, but on the Harry Potter issue, I don't think that it's sin to let your kids watch or read Harry Potter.
Now, here's my question. What if you're one of those parents that stops your kids from reading Lord of the Rings, Narnia, Harry Potter, and then you go blast other parents who are letting the kids? Are you sinning? Am I sinning by going out and blasting them for why you're letting your kids read this?
I would think so, yes, because you're not founding yourself solidly on God's law. In theory you are, because you're looking to the anti-witchcraft law in the Old Testament and saying, I'm anti-witchcraft, and therefore letting your kids watch or listen to things with witchcraft in them is breaking God's law. But be careful when you make those kind of extensions, because if you don't have a firm footing on God's law, you very much risk, and I think this is in case you do, breach the Pharisee thing, right? Where the Pharisees said, well, God's greater than parents, and so therefore, if you give money to God instead of your parents, it's fine, right? And Jesus blasts the Pharisees for that, because that's not actually explicitly in the law, and therefore it was breaking God's law out of tradition. And so when you blast other parents for something that isn't explicitly in God's law, you're being pharisaical, I think. Now, it isn't to say that we can't make real practical applications from the law that we could recommend others to follow and aggressively, assertively advocate for. For instance, anti-homosexuality views, right? Not wanting people to promote LGBTQ plus stuff. As parents, I think you should teach to your kids proper sexuality, and you should advocate for proper sexuality to others as well. So if there's parents that are advocating for their kids to do harmful things to their bodies, whether it's transgenderism or the parents are super pro their kids being LGBTQ plus, I think we're fully founded on the law to be able to advocate that they stop that. So that I don't think that's legalistic. I think that's just holding to God's law. But on the Harry Potter thing, you're taking it multiple steps away from the law. That's where I differ there. And then some classic examples that I don't have a lot of experience with personally, but they're classics for like Deep South fundamental Baptists, but probably multiple regions in the U.S., not just the Deep South.
White suits
to white suits white suits a little flamboyant. Suits to church, gambling, smoking, drinking. Like, yes, agreed. Drunkenness is a sin in the Bible, and being unwise with your money is probably greed at its root, right? Gambling is probably greed at its root, which is not good. Covetousness, but in and of themselves, they are not unclean. And we've had an alcohol episode on this before. Alcohol itself is not unclean. In fact, it's encouraged by God in certain circumstances, right? So drunkenness is a sin, yes, but drinking is not. Same goes for smoking. Same goes for gambling. These things are frowned upon in excess, and therefore the church has historically, and again the Fundamental Baptist Church in particular, has historically frowned upon them, but they've also gone in excess in saying that if you do any of them, you are sinning inherently, and therefore you've added to God's law, right? Just like the Pharisees did. So that would be another classic example of legalism in the practical. What are some examples of too loosey-goosey lawlessness in the church that are specific and practical today? Can you think of any that churches allow that they should not?
Oh my, where to even start? Like, for example, I don't know, maybe it's too much New Testament, but female pastors.
Mm-hmm.
Would you count that as that?
I would. Now, of course, usually a church has some argument why they're allowing female pastors instead of just being like, we're not under law, but under grace. That's not usually their phrasing because it's explicitly from the New Testament where we would make the applications for whether or not there should be male or female pastors. But that's breaking God's New Testament provisions. I agree.
I'm also thinking of Orthodox, more or less Orthodox churches, so, we don't get too crazy out there either.
Yes. So female pastor, I mean, that's an episode in and of itself, right? And the justifications for why we'd say that's breach of God's commands. But yeah, I mean, I'd be in agreement.
Another loosey-goosey, maybe a very relaxed policy with alcohol consumption. Just another one they could think of.
Yeah, it's so, I mean, even in the US where we drink alcohol like anybody else, it's pretty taboo to be like super drunk in the Christian context, so it's probably not super common. But yes, any church that's getting like super drunk is being too loose as well. I think one common one that I see for churches is not calling out and not, in fact, sometimes just pretending like it doesn't matter, fornication. And by that, but fancy word, I'm meaning sleeping with people before marriage, right? A pretty common classic Christian thing to call out, but because it's so common in the US today, like ridiculously common amongst Christians as well, there are many churches who don't bother calling it out, and that's being too loose. And they believe, well, we're not under law but under grace, and therefore, yeah, it might be bad somehow, even though those same churches probably don't hold to the law, but they say somehow we know it's bad, but go ahead and do it because we actually think it's good. We just know it's technically a sin, and therefore we're not going to call it out. I think that's being too loosey-goosey. You're not holding to God's law. That's bad. Equally on some drugs, like this is definitely
I was thinking maybe some drug use, yeah.
Yeah, if they aren't calling out people's drug use, and I'm talking like real damaging drugs like marijuana, arguably, but also heroin and others like that there are some churches who are into like passing out clean needles and making sure, like caring for the addicts, which I understand the heart behind, but you also should be calling out the sin of drunkenness, essentially, right? Drunkenness of heroin. It's not alcohol, but getting drunkenness of excess drugs like that.
Yes. Please do help the people with the proper medical attention that they need. At the same time, you call them to repentance.
Yeah. I mean, definitely an argument for another day on whether or not clean needle drives are really the best thing to be doing, but in any case.
Besides that, other medical help, yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't be ignoring their sin, period.
Mm-hmm.
Again, nuances to how specifically you deal with specific people, so I'm not giving you a blanket rule, but that is something that sometimes churches can ignore for the sake of trying to be kind. And those are just a few specifics. So again, on the more extreme conservative side, there's definitely legalism that's still alive and well in the U.S., and there's definitely lawlessness in the U.S., in the church, and in culture. So the call to all Christians is to not be legalistic, not be making your own rules, not be making your own law that you judge others by, and then equally not ignoring the law, but instead holding to God's law. That way, if you do have a problem with somebody, it's through God's law instead of your own law. And I think we have to be really careful about that, and equally that we're not just our own judges and making up the rules as we go along. So don't be a Pharisee, don't be a heathen, be a Christian. And the call to all of us, as Romans was saying, is we cannot fulfill God's law. So as much as we're advocating, and I'm advocating for the validity of God's law, it does not mean that I think I can fulfill God's law. It just means we should, yes, aim to obey God. If we love God, we should want to obey God. That's straight out of Jesus' mouth, right? It's from the New Testament law, if that gives you any more oomph to it. So we should aim to obey God and his commandments, his law, but we should never think that we are justified by the law, because we aren't. Like I agree with Romans that says that we are not under law but under grace, because you cannot be saved by obeying the law, because no man can. Even if you obeyed all the law like humanly, right? Like you wouldn't be arrested in ancient Israel for what you've done. You still haven't loved God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and you haven't loved your neighbors yourself fully from your heart and mind. And that's what Jesus is getting at, I think, in his Sermon on the Mount, when he says, your righteousness must surpass the scribes and the Pharisees to enter the kingdom of heaven. Because while the scribes and Pharisees might hold to the civic law, so the outward law, they haven't been arrested, they are not fully committing and holding to the law in their hearts and their minds. And that's when he goes into, if you hate your brother, you've murdered him in your heart. Right? So you might not be arrested, but you would not be arrested for murder, and nobody should be arrested on earth for murder of the heart. but you would be held accountable for it in the day of judgment. And that's why we all need payment. We've all sinned against God. And therefore the call of the gospel is, the good news of the gospel is, Jesus Christ fully fulfilled the law, not only for the application that it has for the church today, but also for us each personally. He perfectly fulfilled the law in heart, mind, and action. He perfectly fulfilled the law, and he died a sinner's death to pay for the sins of all the sinners in his elect, in his family, and those that he was paying for. So the call to everyone on earth, regardless of who you are, of course, depending on your reaction, you might be elect or not, but whoever you are, come to Christ, because the only way to salvation is through Jesus Christ. If you hide in him, his righteousness is your righteousness. And therefore, on the day of judgment, you will be saved by the skin of your teeth, not because of your own righteousness, not because of your own actions, not because you fulfilled the law, but because Christ fulfilled the law, and therefore you can live forever with Jesus Christ. And if you do not, you'll be punishable for all the sins you've done, not only the ones you know about, but even the ones you don't know about that God has seen throughout your whole life. Then you will be the most pitiful to be pitied, because separation from God, the judgment that would be declared on you, is worse than anything you've ever experienced in this life. So either choose eternal life and humility in God, or stay in pride, stay in rebellion, and perish forever. That is the call of the gospel.
Mm-hmm. And I like what you said too about the afterlife. And I want to tie it in. Another way that we have peace with God is that not only did he pay for our transgressions, but in his life, but he also took on the wrath of God from the afterlife that was due to us in the afterlife, or will be due, however you want to say it, on him at the cross. Therefore, we do not have the wrath of God pending on us when we die. Hence, we can have peace.
And nor in this life. And I think sometimes Christians are tempted to say, oh, I've sinned and therefore God is going to get me, right? Like, I looked at a woman lustfully and therefore God is going to punish me somehow, right? Like, I'm not going to pass this test, or I'm going to not make this sale or something because I've sinned. It's a quid pro quo. I took something from God, I trespassed against God, and therefore he's going to damage me in some way. Now, sin has consequence on earth, so God certainly brings consequence of sin, but the actual wrath from God is no longer on Christians. And therefore, you don't have to worry like, oh, I've sinned and therefore God is going to get me someday. Like, the sin might have consequences, right? But it's not the wrath of God coming on you. It's the natural consequence of sin, or something to grow you out. It's not just a punishment for you. And that's why we have found our cause in serving the Lord Jesus Christ, from which we find salvation. Thanks for listening. I've been Michael, the man behind the machine, and to my right, your left has been
Sebastian, the bookkeeper.
If you want to see the rest of our episodes, you can go to foundcause.podbean.com and see all of our episodes and download them for your listening pleasure. That's audio only, though. If you want to see all our video episodes and see me and Sebastian's lovely face in our super cool studio here, you can go to youtube.com and search us up, Found Cause there, or go to facebook.com/Found Cause. We're also on iTunes, Spotify, wherever else you might find your podcasts. Until next time, thanks for listening. We talk about something completely different. Tune in. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.